Neil, this is a really ambitious book. I did a book on the Fed, as you know, but I just did one narrow slice. You tried to do the whole world here. Tell me a little bit about how this came to be.
Look, we've been through a remarkable few years. As you know, it started with what we call the subprime crisis, and of course has turned into something much bigger and much more global, and with much broader effects than anything having to do with mortgage securities in the United States. You know, the deepest and darkest phase of the crisis in many ways was the fall of 2008. You wrote a wonderful book on that. Andrew Ross Sorkin did. A number of people have. I wanted to try and capture a slightly different story, of which that's only part, which is this global story, first of all, of how what started as what we thought of as a housing crisis in the United States and a financial crisis became this global conflagration that has endangered the 50 years of progress toward European unity, has worsened the British economy for years and years, has had really this global reach that's affected almost everybody on Earth. And I wanted to tell that through the story that seemed most logical, which is the global central bankers who again and again have been the ones who have tried to corral this rapidly spreading fire and try and contain it, whether it's in Europe with the Eurozone crisis that has endangered that continent, in the U.S. with Ben Bernanke and the Federal Reserve. So I've viewed a lot of the books that were written in 2008, 2009 that captured that very intense, very remarkable crisis fighting stage as a starting point, and tried to capture how that story went from there and the entire arc of this last several years.
And so how long did it take you to do this?
Well, in some ways, I had kind of been building ideas and building threads since I started covering the Federal Reserve in 2007. I started on the Fed beat about a week after what is actually the first scene in the book, the first introduction of the book.
So you're
August 9th, 2007. It's all my fault. August 9th, 2007 is where I start, which is the first day the European Central Bank intervened to prop up the European banking system. A week after that, I wouldn't have put the two together at the time, but I started covering the Fed. So from that point on, I'd been gathering ideas and thread and trying to think through what it all meant. I started seriously thinking about a book in late 2010 and serious reporting on the book into the start of 2011.
And now, as the cover shows, you looked at a number of central bankers, not only Ben Bernanke, but also Mervyn King in the UK, Jean-Claude Trichet in the European Central Bank, Hayami, the Japanese, and some of their successors. Let's talk a little bit about these three men who are on the cover of the book. So first, Ben Bernanke. What do you think people ought to know about Ben Bernanke?
You know, Ben Bernanke, it's a fascinating story. He's I think in some ways he's an accidental Fed chairman. Here he's one of the most consequential central bankers in history, really, and no doubt one of the most important leaders in the history of the Federal Reserve. And I think he will get many more historical treatments. You and I think, both wrote kind of first drafts of that. But I think in many ways, what's surprising is what an accidental series of events it is that led him to the Fed chairmanship. He hadn't served in government. He was a lifelong academic. Entered government for the first time in 2002, thinking it would be a kind of short-term thing. He got a call.
Go back to teaching at Princeton.
Exactly. He got a call to become a Federal Reserve governor, one of seven, not the chairman or anything. It was after 9/11. There was a spirit of patriotism in the air. He had recently been passed over to become the provost of Princeton. And for all those reasons, he said yes and came for what he thought would be a short tour in Washington. Now, he proved to be quite an effective public servant. He was a real thought leader on the Federal Reserve as a governor. President Bush appointed him to his White House chief economist job. And he impressed a lot of people in the Bush administration. But there's one more level of coincidence here, which is that when it came time to replace Alan Greenspan in 2005, George W. Bush was not at his strongest point of his presidency. The Iraq War was a mess. His popularity was low. He had had a failed Supreme Court nomination. And so Bernanke was in many ways a safe choice. If it weren't for all of those things combining, it's very possible, in fact very likely, someone else would have been Federal Reserve Chairman when all this happened.
Right, and of course he ironically was, or fortunately, had been a scholar of the Great Depression, which seemed like a total irrelevant field of scholarship, but turned out to come in pretty handy.
And I'm told this didn't come up in his interviews to be appointed Federal Reserve Chairman with Bush or with those in the White House who were kind of weighing this decision. Bernanke's scholarship and experience with crises, with the Great Depression as a historian, none of that really came up at all, which is it's a coincidence, really.
So how do you think he's changed over the 5 or 6 years that you've been watching him?
He's much more savvy. He's very much the he was and is very much the academic. He's quiet, he's cerebral. He seems to derive very little joy, if any, from the kind of the showmanship of Washington, whether it's flashy parties, whether it's the idea of going schmoozing with politicians. I think none of that appealed to him one bit. He's done it to the degree he has to for his job, but it's not what appeals to him. I think he would much rather be at a Washington Nationals game by himself or with his wife than at a Georgetown dinner party with politicians.
And you describe a little bit in the book about how public speaking wasn't really his strong suit, and he did something about that.
Wasn't, yeah. He had you still hear it once in a while. He has a little quaver in his voice when he's nervous. He worked with a speaking coach early on to help present a more forceful demeanor in congressional hearings and other public settings. But what I mean when I say he's more savvy, I think he's early on he seemed to not understand the cynicism with which a senator or a congressman would yell at him and rail at him in a congressional hearing, and he would seem confused. I thought I had a perfectly good conversation with him at breakfast last week.
Yeah.
I don't understand. Well, it's kind of the routine cynicism of Washington, of politics. He's become a much more savvy person about that.
So if you had to look forward, what grade do you think history will give him?
I think he gets an A. There are plenty of mistakes we can both point to that have been made by Ben Bernanke and the U.S. Federal Reserve over the last several years. The Lehman Brothers failure is Exhibit A. Allowing Lehman to go down and all the bad things that followed is not something to be proud of. There are a number of times when they've moved slowly to understand why monetary policy was not having the effect they hoped, but again and again, what Chairman Bernanke has showed is a willingness to look at the world as it is, to understand what isn't working and why, and to use everything within his power, both as a persuader, as an economist, as a thinker, to find answers to try and get the U.S. economy into a better place.
Okay, so let's turn to Jean-Claude Trichet, who was head of the European Central Bank during the crisis. How is he different from Bernanke? What do you think of him?
He's a different animal. He's a Frenchman who was born in 1942. He's a lifelong public servant. He went to essentially the French finishing school for bureaucrats. Worked in the French Treasury. Made his way to the Banque de France, the French central bank, and really was a real up-and-comer in the 1970s and 80s in the French civil service before becoming a central banker, where he helped manage for France this transition to the euro. So his entire life has been about creating a united Europe, creating instead of you have France and Germany and Italy and Spain, you have a united Europe that has its own currency, has deep ties between nations. That's his life's project. He became president of the European Central Bank in 2003. He is in many ways a veteran crisis fighter. He was a veteran of these battles. It was called the Paris Club, working out debt in Latin American government debt in Latin American and other emerging market countries in the late 80s, early 90s. He's a crisis fighter. It's in his bones. He's a negotiator. He's a arm twister. He can get a deal done when it needs to be done. A less experienced, not much of an economist. He's, Ben Bernanke or Mervyn King are much, bigger economic thinkers. But Trichet he's a skillful maneuverer and operator in a government or central bank kind of setting.
Now, Bernanke really opened the spigots of money in the U.S. I mean, he cut interest rates aggressively at the beginning, and then they've bought trillions of dollars of bonds. The European Central Bank has been less aggressive. Is that because the circumstances are different, or do you think that's just a difference of view between Trichet and Bernanke?
It's more than the individuals. It goes much deeper in the organizations. The ECB, part of its entire framework and thesis under which it was created, it's only been around since 1998. And the theory is you have these European countries that do not have a strong tradition of stable money, of low inflation. You have countries like France and Italy and Spain as part of this currency zone, and Germany, which has very much a tradition, at least since the 20s, of stable money and low inflation. There was a desire to bring some of the credibility of the Bundesbank, the German central bank, to all of Europe. And so a lot of the ways the ECB is set up, it's even in Frankfurt where the Bundesbank also is, they have a single mandate to maintain low and stable inflation, a bit under 2%. The
difference with the Fed is that the Fed has a mandate to worry both about unemployment and inflation.
Exactly. The Fed now does aim for 2% inflation, but they also aim to keep unemployment low. you know, it's kind of in the water in the ECB that even though there's people of all nationalities working